Hello everyone, my name is Catherine Alexandra, and I am the artist who did the project Seedbomb. If you came to see my show and are now listening to this recording for the purpose of learning more, I would like to first very humbly thank you for your time and attention. This is my first large-scale long-term project, and it has meant a lot to me. What I'd like to do today is talk about my process by which I did this project and my intentions with it, as well as some of my personal reflections on the project and what I learned in doing it. What I'm finding these days is that I would like to make art as a means of transmitting information and presenting it and allowing the viewer to take away from it what they can. And that was a big part of what I wanted from this project. Moreover, I wanted to start conversations about themes of gentrification, vandalism, what a community is and what it means to be a part of a community, and the concept of home, housing politics. I also really wanted to highlight the history of activism of the tenants of Cabrini Green and expand what my viewers think of when they imagine an activist. Some of the things that I'm going to discuss will apply to artists. Other things will apply to activists. Pick up whatever feels useful to you. For this project, I took the square footage of a luxury condominium building in the formerly Cabrini Green area, what we would now call River North, and I converted it into an amount of seeds and made those seeds into seed bombs. I put them where the majority of Cabrini Green residents are reported to have ended up, plus some of them were dispersed all around the city in representation of the residents who ended up all around the city and in mixed income housing. Still more of them were saved for the show for people to take and disperse. I used flowers as a symbol of humble offering to begin a conversation. The seeds were symbolic of a resource. They were also the measurement of the resource. For those of you who don't know, seed bombs are pellets of inert matter and seeds. When you throw them, they grow. For my project, I used newspapers and a mix of Midwestern perennials and annuals, so that after the first year, the flowers would keep on coming back. It's a technique that is said to come from West Africa and was a big part of early rice farming, which is a fascinating history in and of itself. Read Judith Carney's Black Rice if you want to really think about intellectual material and early agricultural science in a completely different way. But it's more often attributed to a microbiologist named Masanobu Fukuoka from Japan. It was an early form of guerrilla gardening at its finest, with its roots in the Shinto religion, with the concept that you throw the bomb and it'll grow if nature wishes it to, and it won't if it doesn't. The first thing that I felt like I learned while working on this project is if you have a space to work away from your living space, you probably should work there. Because for around 8 months my entire apartment was covered in paper pulp and smelled like wet cardboard. My bathtub had a ring of newsprint ink around it, and I'm not much of a housekeeper, and so soon I had a ring of newsprint ink around me. The linoleum on my floor got wet and bubbled up. My food processor was wrecked. Then there were the times when I ran out of time and the seeds started to germinate, or when the pulp went sour. The air in my apartment was unreasonably hot and wet. Those were really rough times to live in a 300 square foot studio apartment. Really rough times. The next thing I felt like I learned was how to have a real conversation with someone. I realized really early on, everyone thinks that you have an agenda. Everyone thinks you have an opinion or solutions, and for me this was never the case. I just wanted to communicate information. I started initiating every conversation with the fact that I don't have solutions, and that I'm not an expert on housing problems or city planning, and we had experts who had solutions, and they failed us. I realized that when you open a conversation stating that housing is a complicated issue or a money-issue problem, that people will really talk to you, and they'll really listen to. When you don't go out to prove a point, no one spends time in the conversation trying to disprove you or argue with you, and you're able to give them the facts that will give them a bigger worldview. And you, in turn, get to listen and learn about their worldview and learn about things that you would not have thought about. And it totally changes everything. When I explain this process to someone, she very matter-of-factly explained, when you talk, you're just saying things that you already know, but when you listen, you can be learning. It sounds like such a silly thing to have to say, but it was kind of a game changer. An example of this is when I was interviewing with old residents of Cabrini Green, I met a gentleman named Jay. He was a very lovely man. He was just around 40 and had lived in Cabrini with his wife and 5 children before he was picked up for a drug charge and did time for a felony and got out. His choices were to either divorce his wife and find a place to live on his own, or to move the 7 of them into a small rental space in the far south side. He chose to keep his family together. He worked very hard for a living and told me outside of gang work the best job he ever had was working in a car wash for $5 an hour. At one point, he told me about being too poor to even afford to buy a meal for himself and his wife at McDonald's, but it was such a treat to be able to take his children out for a meal and to be able to let them play. I had been so anti-fast food, anti-corporation, anti-meat, anti-processed food my whole life until then. I felt like such a fool when I realized that the purpose that was being served by the space. While I still disagree with the system of the fast food restaurant and the exploitation of working class people, the corporation, government subsidies on certain foods, GMOs, and a lot of the other parts of this system, I recognize that there's a lot more that meets the eye about who is involved in consuming the products of the system, and I realize that I don't always understand the need for it. I also understood very suddenly the hypocrisy at play in a community that discusses food politics but ignores a big part of why there is a legitimate demand for what they theoretically oppose. On that same note, I wanted to talk about how I realized at some point that my perception was in a lot of ways useless and unknowingly clouded by my privileges at best. To give those of you who don't know me a little more details on who I am, I'd like to explain that I come from a working-class American and Mexican background. My family's made up of factory workers, long-haul truck drivers, quarry workers, welders, security workers, and I've worked in restaurants since I was a teenager, and I still do. So when I went to meet with people who had lived in Cabrini Green, I felt like we would have really similar opinions on how the city cared for Cabrini Green. I thought about the problems with sanitation, I thought about gang problems, I thought about the abusive and sometimes absent policing, I thought about the schools that were completely underserved around it. But when I met someone who had lived in the Greens long term, I realized that he was a lot more moderate about the problems that he faced living in them. I realized that it was a similar opinion held by someone else who had lived in the complex who agreed to be interviewed. In reality, the people who I interviewed were of the opinion that it was a flawed program. It was an ugly program. But at the end of the day, there were times that they needed it and they didn't always have access to it. And they both lived really hard lives after Cabrini, faced homelessness and long-term underemployment. I realized that I simply couldn't understand what the experiences of Cabrini Green residents were like, and the only thing that I could do of any use would be to offer a platform for people to speak from, and then to give those of us who are the other in this situation some perspective. It became a question of understanding how people who are marginalized navigate a system that is for the most part not in their favor. In this project, I learned about the fragility of language. While working on this project, I had an article published about me. The author completely misunderstood the purpose of my project. I had known the author for years and I really like him, but I realized after the article was published that he didn't understand at all what I was doing and didn't realize that what he had done was obscure the purpose of the project. I was devastated. It was my coming out party. The same week, I was visiting family across the country, and I was in the beginning phases of working on my new project, Cage and Garden, and at that point, I was just writing letters with prisoners and doing research. I realized I was writing with someone and I didn't know what she looked like. So in my anxiety-ridden mania, I Googled her. The only Google hits that I got about her were her crime and her writer-prisoner profile. A journalist missed the point of my project and wrote an article about it. But the worst thing my new friend had ever done was the only thing anyone would ever know about her now. So I got over myself and stopped being so damn precious about my work. It was good for me. A similar thing happened at a lunch I was helping host at a gallery. The subject of my project came up, and I was asked to explain it. When I tried to explain my project to the group of people in front of me, one woman didn't understand my project at all. She proceeded to berate me. It took me almost a week, but after thinking about what she said to me, I think she thought I was pro-gentrification. Which is an odd idea to me because before I had started working on this project, I had no idea that there were people who thought that gentrification was a good thing. I thought it was generally accepted that it was bad for poor and working class people. But more on the subject of how homogeneous our worlds become and the problems with that later. The end of that story is that I collected myself and told her that her criticisms were very valuable to me and that understanding what she perceived about my project would help me communicate what I needed to communicate better. After listening to her talk about some of the very things that my project wanted to discuss, we realized we had very similar political leanings and worldviews, but that we had a completely different interpretation of symbols. In my project, I used flowers as a symbol of humbleness and as a humble offering. Because what are you offering when you give a flower to your beloved? What are you offering when you bring flowers to a funeral? What does it mean when you give someone flowers to apologize for some foolish thing you've done? While the specific messages are often different, the spirit in which they're given are always the same. A small, humble token of your thoughts, your concerns, your apologies. To the woman who misunderstood my project, it was about a symbol of growth. I would have never thought about it that way. I realized that there are an endless array of significances for a single object. When we reached the end of our conversation, I realized that I had a bigger impact on her understanding of my project and myself as an artist by sitting down with her and talking about the project, because it was a subject of such strong feelings and touched a part of her identity as a Chicagoan. In the end, I understood how to communicate better for the misunderstanding, that is, and got to pick someone else's brain about how they think about symbolism. It was good. Another thing that I realized during the process of this project, and it may be a factor that it overlapped with the research of my next project, Cajun Garden, in which I'll be constructing 2.3 million seed bombs to represent the 2.3 million people in prison. But one thing that I realized in the work that I did was that my world is incredibly homogeneous. I realized that I had previously felt really self-satisfied, that my circle of friendships were really diverse, with friends from all different socioeconomic classes, ethnicities, gender expressions and orientations, religions. But in reality, when I was working on this project and studying my next one, I realized I had no friends who had ever been forced to give up their children to the foster care system. I had no friends who had been homeless long term. I had no friends who had HIV/AIDS. I knew no one who had been incarcerated long term or were currently incarcerated, and I had no friends who were currently living in public housing. I realized that there was a huge swath of the American experience that I had no familiarity with, and that informed my worldview in a way that was limited. It has been so satisfying and such a great privilege to change that. I feel like I've been able to grow so much from the generosity of the people that I've met, who have been so open and candid to talk to me about really personal aspects of their life. It's redefined my appreciation for people's strength in the face of hardship, their selflessness, devotion to the ones they love in their community, and their ability to be a force of change in the most difficult situations. Another thing that was really important to me was to talk about the nature of activism in the community. Cabrini Green has a strong history of tenant activism that existed until its very end. The tenants worked with each other as if they were social workers, helping each other connect with alternative housing when they were being mass evacuated. They helped each other file paperwork. They went so far as to set up offices in empty apartments. They formed the Cabrini Green Local Advisory Committee and went to meetings with the Chicago Housing Authority and developers. They became partners in the redevelopment of their community and the revitalization projects that were planned citywide. They even helped draft their own plans to fairly redevelop the area. They defended their resources for as long as they could. They did things I didn't even realize were possible, but it's not really talked about in the legacy of Cabrini Green. When I talk to people about Cabrini, I did occasionally get a story of activism. One of the women that I interviewed for my project had been homeless for a long stretch of time after she left Cabrini, and when she got out on the other side, she went to volunteer at the center on Halsted, and still does. I recently met a woman who comes to the bar where I work, and we were chatting, and she asked me what I had been doing, and I told her about my project, and she told me about going to volunteer in Cabrini. She had come from a middle-of-nowhere town in central Indiana, and had left a long and very abusive marriage, and had regularly helped out at a homeless shelter after moving to Chicago. Some of the residents told her they were going to go work on some apartments in Cabrini, so she said she'd come along to help out. When she got there, they were cleaning up and repairing the empty apartments with the help of some Cabrini Green residents. When they were done, the homeless people were to live there. Within a few weeks, the police were alerted and made the homeless people move out, and then destroyed the apartments. Later, some families in the Greens invited some of the homeless people to live with them temporarily, in another act of selflessness and kindness. The history of activism is a part of the history of Cabrini Green that I worry the most will get lost. It was an unexpected surprise, but when I installed the show, people started to connect with one another. I had the deep honor to talk to a young woman who had lived in Cabrini Green as it was being suddenly evacuated. It seemed like when the show was being set up, people who had been too young to really know anything about Cabrini Green were learning about it in an unbiased way. People who had lived there during different parts of its existence were connecting and sharing stories. It was such a privilege to hear firsthand about the diversity of experiences that were had in the complex. In the book Cabrini Green in Words and Pictures by David Whitaker, you can read about some of the different experiences that people had while living in the Greens and the connections that people felt to their community. It's a really lovely read. The next thing that I would like to talk about is something very specific to my current worldview, and I don't expect anyone to agree with me. I just hope that you will take this idea into consideration, and perhaps we can change the way that we use language. I want to talk about the difference between problems and symptoms. By this point of learning about Cabrini Green and trying to put it into the context of a city's history and an American history, I really started to think about things less in terms of Cabrini Green was a problem, and more that the issues of Cabrini Green are symptoms of a bigger problem, like being systematically oppressed through deprivation of resources such as good educations, sufficient paying work, adequate medical care, affordable child care, discriminatory housing, and sky-high incarceration rates. When we take into consideration the majority of Cabrini Green's residents were single mothers, and even today, women make 33% less than men, and women of color on average make even less than white women, you start to understand the widespread poverty of the complex. When you consider that while we have laws about turning away prospective residents from renting homes on the basis of race or national origin, but we have little to no entity enforcing the laws and challenging property owners. When you know that 1 out of every 3 black men will end up in prison at some point in his life, you have to start thinking about what that means to 1 in every 3 black women and their children. I realized that the crime and problems in Cabrini Green were really symptomatic of the oppression and exploitation that happened outside of it, so I began explaining it this way. I just started telling people, communities aren't bad. Communities are oppressed. Communities are marginalized. Communities are underserved. Communities are exploited. Communities are abusively policed. So with this, I decided to erase the concept of the bad neighborhood from my conversations and my friends' and family's knowledge. Because a neighborhood is just the geographical coordinates of a community, and I personally believe that there's no such thing as a bad community. If you agree, I'd like you to do the same. I want you to recognize this every time you walk into a neighborhood that is what your parents' generation might call a bad neighborhood. In the research that I did, I found interviews that other people had done with Cabrini Green residents, and I realized how tight-knit a community it really was. There was a story of a woman who had several children, one of whom had a chronic illness, and if he experienced seizures that lasted for a certain amount of time, then she would have to take him to the hospital, and she could just knock on a neighbor's door and let her know, and her neighbor would watch her other children until she got back. When she was relocated, she experienced no such familiarity or support. It's also really important to note that towards the end, 25% of Cabrini was reported as being single mothers, and the rest were mostly children. I would also like for people to think about the role that patriarchy plays in our knowledge of and opinions around Cabrini Green. It occurred to me at one point in this project that there's something inherently patriarchal in the belief that a large group of poor people can't peacefully live together. While I strongly agree that large complexes of public housing are deeply problematic, and history proves that they don't work, there is an undertone of classism and racism that come along with our feelings around the people who inhabit them. There is a lack of responsibility that we take in our everyday lives when we don't consistently challenge ourselves and ask if we're compliant in a system that oppresses people. But then we blame communities for generations of poverty. These are inherent biases that everyone possesses to a certain degree. The only way to challenge oppression is to be a part of a system that supports people. Sometimes this means having uncomfortable conversations with people you don't agree with, and using the privileges of your race, class, education, knowledge, gender, what have you, to change people's minds and educate them. For me, in a way, it meant being a go-between. Sometimes it means listening to what is needed of you and recognizing when things that you have thought and done were wrong. Sometimes it just means educating yourself on the issues that you want to be of service to. When I wrote this reflection, everything I had to say seemed so abundantly obvious, but I realized that until I got really in depth, I didn't have the words to discuss it. I wonder if I had never gotten involved in working with prisoners, or if I hadn't gotten involved with organizations that deal with abusive policing, or Red Bell Hooks, or Outer Lord, would I have ever learned how these compartmentalized systems work together as a whole? The last thing that I've been thinking about are the responsibilities that come with my privileges, and frankly, I have more questions than I have answers. As a person who's been so privileged to be able to discuss and connect with people who've been so deeply affected by structural racism and classism, I want to be able to connect with and discuss structural racism and how it works with anyone who doesn't know about it, and if they don't believe in it, try and convince them, and make changes in my own spaces that challenge it and change it. I've come to realize the importance of getting involved with the way my community interacts with legislation that affects marginalized communities. I would want to inspire other people to be aware of the lasting effects of structural racism and classism and to try and make changes in their spaces. As someone who knows about the school-to-prison pipeline, I think it may very well be my responsibility to try and educate other people who may not understand it, and more importantly, get involved in changing it. My job as an artist and activist feels like it should give a platform for people who are not traditionally given a platform to speak about their experiences and needs. Most important is my approach to opening discussions about issues of social justice. I have to actively work to always portray with respect and dignity the experiences of, lives, beliefs, and choices of others. I've watched so many other artists and activists fail in this. With the wrong framing, even the best message can be obscured. I take issue with the painting of potato eaters. We have to be constantly critical of our own organizations and beliefs that may be exclusive and harmful. We have a responsibility to promote other artists and activists whose intellectual materials wouldn't necessarily get a spot on center stage, and let them tell their stories, and most importantly, support them with whatever means they need. I hope you got something out of my project and reflection, so thanks for listening.